Well, today is the fourth Sunday in Lent. Throughout the life of the church, if you go over into the Roman Catholic world, the fourth Sunday of Lent is this kind of reprieve Sunday that you get. You know, every Sunday is a day during Lent that we kind of get the fasting is relaxed a little bit. We get to enjoy the hope of the resurrection and get to celebrate a little bit. But particularly on the fourth Sunday of Lent, in the Catholic world, it's called Laetare Sunday, which means to rejoice. And so if you want to do a little extra rejoicing today, that is completely acceptable. It's also the only day in the Roman Catholic Church that you can get married. I know that because me and my wife Elizabeth were married. Just happenstance happened to be on the fourth Sunday in Lent, and we discovered on that Sunday that that's something that you can do. So let's turn our eyes to Scripture. So in last week's gospel lesson, we heard about Jesus cleansing the temple. I didn't figure that would be a great text to preach on, coming in as your rector, Jesus flipping the tables and doing all that sort of stuff. So I went with a different passage. But I want to begin this morning by thinking about this passage and then leading into the gospel passage that we had for this Sunday. So Jesus cleansing the temple. It's Passover in that reading from last week, that great Jewish feast, remembering Israel's escape from Egypt. And Jesus famously enters the temple area. He finds people selling oxen and sheep and pigeons for sacrifices, and he finds money changers whose job was to exchange coins that had pagan images on them to acceptable temple coins. You couldn't have a coin that had a pagan image on it in the temple. And the exchange rate was extremely high. So he sees all these things being sold. He sees this exchange happening. Jesus gets angry. He fashions a whip, Indiana Jones style. He drives the animals out, flips the tables, pours the coins of the money changers out. It's this incredible scene, and it ends with the disciples remembering the Old Testament verse, "Zeal for the Lord's house will consume me." Jesus is passionate about the temple, his Father's house. He wants it to remain a house of prayer. Well, a crowd gathers around Jesus, as tends to happen in the Gospel of John when he does something crazy like that, and they want him to explain his actions. They want a sign. They want something that will show that Jesus has the authority to do these seemingly crazy things. Jesus responds to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Jesus is talking cryptically about himself. His body is the temple. He is the Word made flesh, God incarnate. And at the end of John's gospel, Jesus' body will be raised from the dead. But the crowd, they have no categories for what Jesus is saying. Jesus is talking about a temple. They're all standing there in the temple courts in Jerusalem. So they think that Jesus is talking about that temple. They think that Jesus is talking about that temple in Jerusalem that took 46 years to build. There's no way that Jesus is going to rebuild that temple in 3 days. And the crowd is left confused. Throughout John's gospel, Jesus says things or does things, and then we get to see how people respond to those things. Jesus says things that will make sense later in the story, but when people hear Jesus say these things initially, they're left scrambling for answers. They're left trying to put what he's saying in the categories that they understand. And we are left wondering how we would respond in these same situations. If I was standing there in the temple with Jesus, would I understand what Jesus was saying? Probably not. I probably would struggle with it. John's gospel says that it's only after the resurrection that Jesus' closest disciples understand what he meant when he talked about the temple being raised in 3 days. So Jesus is often hard to understand. And if we're honest, Jesus is often hard for us to understand in the present. We have experiences in life that shake our faith or rattle our ideas about how God should respond in particular situations. We wonder if God will come through for us. We wonder about unanswered prayer. And we're left wondering, how do I respond to Jesus in the midst of this circumstance or this situation or this set of difficulties? Do I give up on him? Do I double down on what I already believe about him? Or do I do something else? In our gospel lesson this morning, we're told another Passover story. We get 3 of these Passover stories throughout John's gospel. It's the story of the feeding of the 5,000. This is one of Jesus' famous stories. It's recorded in all 4 gospels. And it's a story where we get to see how different people respond to Jesus and his actions. Jesus isn't at the temple anymore. He's up in an area around the Sea of Galilee. We've gone from bustling city, the center of Jewish life, now into the rural countryside. But just like the temple, there's a crowd that's gathered around Jesus. A crowd is following him around because they've seen him do miracles. They've seen him heal the sick. Jesus and his disciples, they go up a mountain and they sit down, and the crowd follows them up the mountain, follows them up the hill, and there in the rural Galilean countryside, Jesus turns to his disciple Philip and asks him a question. Where is this crowd going to get some food? Where are they going to eat? Philip is from Galilee. He's a local. He knows where to find bread. And the crowd is certainly hungry. They follow Jesus up a mountain in the middle of the countryside. And there's at least 5,000 men in the crowd. That doesn't count the women and children that is also alongside them. That's a lot of bread that Philip is going to need to find. So Philip thinks through how to answer Jesus' question. It's worth considering how we would respond to Jesus in this situation. Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? That's what Jesus asks. What is the correct answer to that question? The passage doesn't tell us the correct answer, so what would it be? How would you answer Jesus in that moment? I think that many of our answers would be similar to Philip's answer. Philip looks at the crowd. He looks at 5,000 men and numerous women and children who are alongside them, and he sees only impossibility. He sees the impossible nature of the situation. Philip tells Jesus, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. A denarii is a day's wages in that world. So 200 days' work would not be enough to pay for all of the food that is needed to feed this group just a little bit of food for them. Philip hears Jesus' question. He looks at the situation, and he immediately tries to figure out a solution with the resources that are available to him. He filters Jesus' question through the categories that he already has in place. You feed people by buying bread. There are too many people, and there's not enough money, there's not enough bread to go around. And that's the end of Philip's answer. It just ends there. There's no expectation, there's no creativity, just this is the way things are, and it's impossible. We're told that Jesus' question about where to find bread is a test for Philip. Throughout the Bible, God tests people. He does things or asks questions to see how they will respond, to see what they believe about him. And when Jesus tests Philip, Jesus discovers that when Philip is faced with an impossible situation, he will immediately think about how that situation can be solved through the material resources available to him. The thing to notice about Philip's response to Jesus is how quickly he answers. Jesus asks the question, and Philip immediately knows his answer. There's no back and forth with Jesus. There's no question leveled back at Jesus. Philip just thinks the situation is impossible, and that's the end of it. Philip's response to Jesus reminds me of something that there's a Canadian sociologist named Charles Taylor, and it's something that he once talked about. So Charles Taylor talks a lot about how society has become increasingly secular in the past century or so, but really centuries before that. And not simply secular in the sense that God is being shoved out of public life, but secular in the sense that we don't think about God being active in the world around us. People, both Christian and non-Christian, tend to think of the world as being just simply physical. God might exist, but he's somewhere out there and he has very little to do with the immediate world around us. So the world, according to Taylor, is seen as closed. It's a closed system. And many people live as if the world is closed off to God, closed off to God's action. Philip embodies this closed perspective on Jesus. He's followed Jesus around, he's seen Jesus do some amazing things, but when asked about finding bread, Philip's world is closed off to Jesus' action and is closed off to the thought that Jesus might be the one who can do something about the situation. When asked where to find bread, Philip could have responded, "I don't know, but I trust you," or "You're Jesus, give us some bread." But instead, he's closed off to Jesus' action in his life. So that's one response to Jesus in this passage. It's closed off, looking at the impossibility and only considering material solutions that are right there in front of your face. The next response that we see is Andrew's. So Andrew is Simon Peter's brother. What do we see him do? I really like Andrew's response to Jesus here. It is not perfect, and it's easy for us to kind of skip over. But it's more creative than Philip's response. Andrew finds a boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he brings that food to Jesus. Andrew has no idea what Jesus will do with the bread and the fish, and really no expectations about what Jesus is going to do. He doubts that anything can be done with so little. But he still brings it to Jesus. He's still making something available to Jesus. And there's a little bit of faith there. In Charles Taylor's framework, Andrew is not as closed off as Philip is. Taylor would say that Andrew's world is more open to the action of God, the supernatural acting in the natural world. Philip only sees impossibility. Andrew also sees impossibility, but he brings something to Jesus, seeing what might happen. So we have 2 responses to Jesus' question, 2 responses to an impossible situation. How does Jesus respond? The beautiful thing about this passage is that we are told up front that the disciples do not respond well to Jesus. They doubt, they only see impossibility, they fail the test. But Jesus does not fail them. What do we hear Jesus do? He takes the bread, he gives thanks for it, and then he starts to give it to the people. And he keeps giving it until everyone has plenty to eat. In John's gospel, we get this image of Jesus being the one that gives out the bread. Jesus does the miracle, and then he goes out and gives bread. It's almost this image of him going one by one throughout those 5,000 people, giving each person bread and fish, making sure each person is fed. Jesus, like Moses, is this person who is giving bread to the people of God in the wilderness. He feeds them. In this passage, it doesn't matter to Jesus if Philip believes, or if Andrew believes, or if the crowd believes. It's because it's really the response of Jesus that matters. Jesus sees the need, and being the Son of God, being God in human flesh, he feeds everyone. And it is abundant. There are 12 baskets full of food at the end of the meal. And Philip and Andrew and the crowd are all left amazed at who Jesus is. The final response to Jesus that we see in this passage is the response of the crowd. The crowd eats their fill. They eat all that bread and that fish, and they are amazed. Jesus has just fed a crowd miraculously, and that crowd, they know their Old Testament. They know what Jesus is embodying here. So Jesus' actions, they bear a striking resemblance, as I said, to God giving manna in the wilderness, that bread from heaven, that bread that the Jewish people, when they're wandering around in the Exodus with Moses, wandering around in that desert, they look at this thing that comes down from heaven and they ask, what is it? It's this sweet bread that comes from heaven. So the crowd looks at what Jesus has done, and they declare that Jesus is the prophet who is to come into the world. Jesus is like Moses. And Moses is the greatest figure in Jewish history. And the crowd begins to get really hyped up because here he is. The prophet's arrived. And the crowd gets really, really hyped, and Jesus perceives that they are going to take him by force and make him king. And this take him by force and make him king thing is the response that I want us to pay attention to. Before the miracle takes place, Philip responds to Jesus by trying to fit Jesus into the categories that he has for the world around him. After the miracle takes place, the crowd does the same thing that Philip does. They want to take Jesus, the one who has given them this wonderful gift of food, this gift of grace and hospitality, this gift that they're meant to enjoy in the moment. And what do? They want to fit him into the category that they have for great men. Jesus is powerful, so they're going to force him to become king and become the king that we, the crowd, want him to be. The crowd can't rest in the miracle that has just happened. They can only see what Jesus and his power can do for them. But Jesus and his power won't work for the crowd. Jesus is not an earthly king. His kingdom is famously not of this world. He will become king, but he will become king on his terms, enthroned on a cross at the end of John's gospel. And he will sit at the right hand of the Father in heaven. But he will not be the king that this crowd wants him to be. The crowd will need to wait for Jesus to reveal his kingship on his terms. So Jesus withdraws from the crowd, he slips away, and he goes off by himself. Something that we see Jesus routinely do throughout the Gospels. He does this amazing thing, and then he slips away. He disappears. Like the story of Jesus cleansing the temple, the story of the feeding of the 5,000 shows us how people respond to Jesus. Philip sees only an impossible situation. He doesn't see what Jesus could do or really who Jesus is. If he understood the identity of Jesus, which is something that John's gospel repeatedly comes back to, showing who Jesus is. If Philip understood who Jesus was, he would know what to ask for. Philip also struggles to see what Jesus can do, but he brings bread and fish to Jesus. And when Jesus does the miracle, the crowd responds with applause and a desire to use Jesus for their own ends. We see each of these responses in the passage, and we see each of these responses in our lives. Like Philip, we struggle to see what Jesus will do in an impossible situation, so we resign ourselves to nothing happening. Like Andrew, we question God while also offering oftentimes what we have as a kind of meager act of faith. And like the crowd, we can try to get Jesus to serve our own ends, whatever those ends are, to kind of fit him in our categories for what we want. So what is the correct response to Jesus? The correct response is the one that we have when we sit down and read this story. We are the other person in this story. As the reader, we look to see what happens next. We allow our judgment to be suspended for a moment while we wait for Jesus to act, while we wait for the story to unfold. Patience is the response of a disciple. Philip is unable to simply sit with the question that Jesus asks him. He jumps to the impossibility. Andrew provides resources, but he also jumps to the impossibility. The crowd wants Jesus to become king, And they want him to become king now, even to the point of wanting to force him to be king. But for the reader, we get to sit and wait and see what Jesus will do next. And it is through that patience that the disciples are going to see the fullness of who Jesus is. They have to wait for the whole story to unfold before they know who Jesus is fully, until Jesus is raised from the dead, and then they will understand who he is. So patience is the response of the disciple. But even when we are impatient, even when Philip and Andrew see only the impossible, even when the crowd is going to make Jesus king, Jesus still feeds them. Jesus still gives them grace and a glimpse of his glory. When we are impatient, when we are struggling to listen to Jesus, if we're struggling to sit with Jesus, Jesus is patient with us. In a few moments, we are going to receive bread and wine at this table. Jesus once again gives us bread from heaven, manna in our wilderness. Later in John 6, we hear about Jesus being the bread of life, the bread that has come down from heaven. And Jesus, every week at this table, gives us bread. He gives us himself again and again and again. Despite our doubts, despite our struggles, despite our wonderful things that we do, we come to this rail and we kneel down and we receive bread in our hands and wine, and we receive Jesus, and he is there. He is always there for us. That is who Jesus is. He is patient. He is long-suffering. And so, receive him at this table so that his grace and his goodness will become more real to you, whatever you're feeling, whether you're going through doubts or struggles or you're really doing great. Receive his grace here at this table today. Amen.